This story took place in July of 2003. I was 13, about to start middle school, when my father decided to take me and my older brother, let's call him Mark, on a fishing trip in Alaska. My dad worked in the Chicago steel industry and had a business associate in Anchorage. They had planned this trip to bond over fishing in the remote areas of southern Alaska. The associate was bringing his teenage daughter along, so Dad decided to take his two middle children, me and Mark. Mark and I were very close, always getting into harmless trouble together, so our parents often called us the double trouble duo. Mom figured that being in the wilderness would keep us out of trouble for a change. Our destination was a 2-day drive from Chicago. We first drove to Seattle, where we spent the night, and then met up with Dad's business friend the following morning to continue north. The area we were heading to was pretty far out there. The scenery was beautiful, but this part of Alaska was so remote that not many people spoke English. Mark had done 2 years of high school Spanish, and I had just started learning French, but neither language helped much out there. Fortunately, Dad spoke the local dialect fluently, and the lady who served us lunch was patient with our clumsy attempts to communicate. A few hours after lunch, we veered off the main road and soon found ourselves on a path where we were practically the only ones around, aside from some local logging trucks. Mark and I, being kids from the suburbs, were fascinated by the massive trucks carrying giant tree trunks. We even joked about meeting some rugged lumberjacks. We were still laughing about it when we arrived at the outfitter's place. Dad purchased fishing permits, and we packed all our gear and food onto the company's boat. The ride down the river was breathtaking. Towering forests, mountains in the distance, a crystal-clear lake, and the sound of nothing but the boat's engine. We passed by a few small cabins along the shore, each with its own dock and rowboats. A couple of them had smoke rising from chimneys. We continued deeper across the lake, heading south. Dad had mentioned we'd be staying in a cabin on a lake, but what he hadn't said was that it was on a tiny island in the middle of the lake. The only way to reach it was by boat. The island was small, with just enough room for the cabin, a pile of firewood, and a dock with 2 rowboats. The closest shore was a few hundred yards away. There would be no lumberjacks or even squirrels for us to meet. We pulled up to the dock, unloaded our supplies, and settled into the cabin. It was small but cozy, with bunk beds and a wood stove. After unpacking, we started preparing dinner, some canned stew. We tried making small talk with the associate's daughter, who was around 16. She seemed shy and awkward, but we tried to be friendly. Still, Mark and I shared silent looks behind her back, rolling our eyes in unison. We were doing this for Dad, after all. That night, with nothing to do, no TV or electronics, we went to bed early. The idea of an early bedtime would have annoyed us back in Chicago, but here it seemed fitting. Mark and I giggled for a while in our bunks until Dad told us to quiet down. Mark joked, "This is why boys don't do sleepovers," which made us both crack up again. We woke up before dawn, had breakfast, bacon, toast, and coffee. I can't stand eggs. And then headed out onto the lake in 2 rowboats. The mist rolled over the water in the soft morning light, making the lake look magical. It was my first time fishing, and I quickly realized I hated it. The dads were having a great time bonding, which was the whole point of the trip. The associate kept trying to talk to Mark, even though we'd both told him we had friends back home. After a while, I managed to catch one fish, a large pike, the biggest any of us would catch that trip. But I dreaded having to learn how to clean it. In total, we caught enough fish for a few meals and then returned to the cabin for lunch. That afternoon, I decided not to go back out on the lake. I told Dad I'd stay behind to tend to the fire and prepare dinner. I think he understood that I'd given fishing my best shot. Mark gave me a look, pleading for me to join him since he didn't want to be stuck alone with the associate's daughter. But I wasn't budging. While they were out on the water, I tidied up the cabin and went outside. It was so peaceful. That's when things started to get strange. I noticed that the usual sounds of the wilderness, birds, insects, were missing. The thick forest on the shore across the lake felt untouched by humans, as though no one had ever walked there before. But then, I saw something. A tall, human-like figure in the shadows, staring back at me. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks, but then it moved slightly. It was large, with a head that resembled a deer's, but it stood on two legs, and it was staring at me with a sense of hostility. I was grateful for the lake between us, but the encounter made me uneasy. I hurried back into the cabin and locked the door. I grabbed a book and tried to distract myself. When Dad returned and knocked on the door, I pretended I had locked it because of the wind. He seemed to buy it. Later, I pulled Mark aside and told him what I had seen. At first, he teased me, saying I was just imagining things, but eventually he realized I was serious. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, watching us. The next morning, they all went fishing again. I stayed behind, still feeling uneasy. As I stared across the lake at the forest, I found myself wondering if I could swim over there. The thought became an obsession. What would happen if I went there, the first human to set foot on that shore? By the time everyone came back from fishing, I was glad we were leaving that afternoon. Less than 2 months later, I started middle school, and the world changed. Looking back, I've traveled and seen a lot since then, but I've never encountered a forest as wild or untouched as the one in Alaska. Sometimes, I wonder what might have happened if I had crossed the lake. The following story was shared on an online forum on April 22, 2013, under the title The Fallen Tree by an anonymous poster. I've only told this to a few people, and even now, thinking about it still sends chills down my spine. I was about 17 at the time, growing up in a small rural town. Exploring the surrounding hills was a common activity. This event took place at the northern edge of Crystal Valley, in Elko County, Nevada, near an old road off Highway 93 that leads into the valley. I've always been fascinated by abandoned mines and ghost towns, so I was eager to check out some places I'd seen marked on old maps at the local diner in my hometown of Wells. I fueled up my old 1972 Dodge pickup and, being an enthusiast of guns, brought along my 91 Hong Kong dollars rifle. After finding some ruins in the lower hills, I ventured further into the mountains, discovering abandoned mine shafts along the way. I followed an old road, now little more than an overgrown trail, until I came across a large fallen tree, a pinyon pine that blocked my path. After driving a bit further, I parked the truck and decided to proceed on foot. I always carried a rifle for protection, as I'd encountered mountain lions near mine shafts before. I climbed over the tree and immediately felt something was wrong, like I was being watched. It was an eerie feeling that grew stronger as I walked along. The silence was unsettling. No birds, no insects, just complete stillness. It was early summer, so normally, the air would be buzzing with the sound of cicadas, but after crossing that tree, there was nothing. As I continued, I spotted a massive rock about 15 feet across that looked like it had once blocked the road before sliding off due to erosion. It appeared to be a reddish limestone, not common in that area. There were markings on the rock, but years of weather had worn them down. Despite my growing unease, I pressed on toward an old cabin I had heard about. When I reached it, I noticed that unlike other abandoned cabins I'd explored, this one was in relatively good shape. The windows were intact, and there were tattered curtains behind the glass. The place felt wrong, but I went inside. The cabin was fully furnished. An old mattress, cookware, tattered clothes, and even faded pictures remained. But what really unnerved me was the dining table, set as if 4 people were ready to sit down for a meal. It was as though the occupants had left in a hurry, abandoning everything. I stepped back outside, feeling the weight of the silence again. I decided to load my rifle, and the sound of the chambering echoed through the canyon, offering a brief moment of comfort. Behind me, I noticed an old well. As I approached it, I was hit by an overpowering stench. Something had died down there. The smell of decay and something metallic filled the air. I turned away from the well and spotted the entrance to a mine shaft nearby. A hot breeze blew out of the shaft, which struck me as odd, since mine shafts usually maintain a cool temperature. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being watched. The feeling of dread intensified. Just as I neared the entrance, the smell of rot hit me even harder. I knew I had to leave. As I turned to go, I saw a shadow moving inside the mine. It was large, hunched, and covered in fur. At first, I thought it might be a mountain lion, but it was much bigger. Panic set in. I raised my rifle and fired several rounds at it, hearing the distinct thuds of the bullets hitting their mark. The creature let out a scream unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was in pain, and then I heard more screams from the well and the hills above me. I ran as fast as I could toward my truck, hearing movement in the trees. Whatever these things were, they were fast and closing in. I emptied my magazine, loaded a fresh one, and kept running. By the time I reached the fallen tree, the creatures were just behind me, moving from tree to tree. I fired more rounds before reaching my truck. I got in, started the engine, and sped off, not slowing down until I hit the pavement. When I finally made it home, I was in shock. My dad, who had been a hunting guide in the Ruby Mountains for 2 decades, noticed my state and asked where I had been. I told him I had been exploring north of Crystal Valley. His face grew serious, and he told me never to go back there, especially alone. We never spoke of it again. I've never returned, partly because I now live in western Nevada, but there's always been a part of me that wants to go back, as if something is calling me. One day I will return, but next time I'll bring a camera and friends, just in case. Years later, I asked some locals about the area. One old-timer shared a story about the 1940s when military planes would crash in the Ruby Mountains during bad weather. Ranchers were sometimes called in to help recover the bodies. One rancher told me they found the bodies of an entire crew laid out side by side, as if someone had moved them after the crash. The story only deepened the mystery of what I encountered that day. I want to start by saying I'm sorry. Please don't think this is one of those tales where I make you carry the monster from my mind into yours. I just need to share this. I'm from Lebanon, and we have our own version of the werewolf called the Narfel. I always thought it was just a myth. The legend says that a high-ranking official in the resistance, along with a member of the Paranormal Defense Unit, made a pact with intelligent beings that weren't human, creatures with fur that could speak an ancient dialect called Tashin. To me, this sounded like some fabricated origin story, a piece of propaganda to boost the morale of the Lebanese. You know, something like, we can do anything, but there are those who swear it's real. I didn't buy into any of it, not until I went to Europe and had my own encounter. My cousin and I traveled to northern Italy to film a promotional video. We were staying at a cabin near the edge of a forest, maybe 300 kilometers of woods with caves scattered throughout. One night, we went to film a scene deep in the woods. My cousin thought it'd be best to shoot at night. We did this for several days, and for 3 weeks, everything was fine. But on the 4th week, just as we were packing up our gear after a long shoot, we started hearing strange scratching sounds and growls. My cousin looked almost pleased, like he was hearing from an old friend. I thought it was odd, but I didn't say anything. This continued for 6 nights straight, always between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. On the 8th day, after the first encounter, we found scratch marks on the side of the cabin. My cousin nearly cried, but it was more like tears of joy. By the 14th day, we found fur stuck to a thorny bush near the cabin. My cousin mumbled something under his breath, Kavari, or something like that, which meant nothing to me at the time. On the 17th day, I saw something behind the cabin. It looked like a wolf, but it didn't make sense. This was Italy. Wolves don't usually wander around these parts. Then, to my shock, the thing stood up on two legs. It was walking upright. My cousin came into my room and, in his broken English, told me, "No worry, you must sleep now." I tried to explain what I saw, but he just sat me down and told me the same old story about how Lebanon made a deal with the Narfel. For the first time, I found myself wondering if there was some truth to it. Then came day 28, the worst day. My cousin called me outside to stargaze since we didn't get to do that often back home. As I stepped outside, I heard the creature before I saw it. It spoke a familiar phrase in Tashin, something like, "It's been too long, my friend." My cousin stood up and, without hesitation, repeated the word Kavari and began walking toward this beast. That's when I realized my cousin wasn't just reckless. He was completely out of his mind. Felt like hours, but in reality it was only a few seconds. My cousin spoke in Tashin again, something like, "Greetings, comrade." To my utter disbelief, the wolf creature responded. They were speaking. I couldn't understand what was being said. I was too terrified to think straight. Just as I was about to run, my cousin stopped me, urging me not to move. Then he bent down and I noticed two smaller figures next to the larger one. Whatever he said to them, I didn't hear. All I caught was his final phrase, "Farewell until next time." In that moment, I finally understood. His story wasn't just madness. There was truth to it. Lebanon really did have some sort of connection to these beings. My cousin wasn't a liar or a fool. To these creatures, he was family, a protector, even though most stories about the Narfel involve terror, death, or worse. I can't shake the feeling that I'm somehow responsible for everything that happened. Now, you understand why I apologized. We Lebanese have always believed these creatures to be intelligent, capable of emotions, and that maybe, just maybe, our ancestors had something to do with their existence. While I think my cousin was doing what he thought was right for them, I'm not so sure it was best for the rest of humanity. I've been living out here in the forest for quite some time, and it's been peaceful. But recently, something has disrupted that peace. At first, little things would go missing, small objects that I couldn't track down. But soon, things got more serious. You see, I have a small chicken coop because I thought it'd be fun to raise chickens and collect fresh eggs. But about 2 months ago, some of the chickens started disappearing. I think I've finally figured out what's been taking them. About 2 weeks back, I was shutting down my cabin one night around midnight. While I was locking up, the motion sensor lights by my shed suddenly turned on. I thought it was odd, but assumed it was probably just some animal. By then, I had reinforced the chicken coop, so I wasn't too worried. Curious, I peeked out the window to see what was out there. What I saw looked like a wolf, but something was off about it. I couldn't pinpoint what exactly, but it made me uneasy. I watched as it managed to break into the coop, which I believed was secure from anything except a human. It was shocking. After a moment, the creature stepped out of the coop, and to my disbelief, it stood upright on its hind legs. My dog, who was by my side, growled at the creature. Before I could stop him, the beast locked eyes with us. My dog immediately backed down, and I followed suit, quietly calling him to me. We both retreated to my bedroom upstairs, locking the door behind us. I moved a heavy dresser in front of the door, just in case. I had a shotgun, a basic model but reliable, and I loaded it just to be safe. I sat there on the bed with my dog, listening as the thing outside prowled around the house for hours. It grunted and paced, making my heart race. When dawn finally arrived, I carefully moved the dresser and crept downstairs. I looked out every window, but there was no sign of it. Relieved, I grabbed my keys and told my dog, "We're getting out of here." As we headed toward my truck, the woods around the house were eerily quiet. If you've ever been in the wilderness, you know that's not a good sign. Then I saw it about 50 feet away, just watching us. Without wasting any time, I fired my shotgun. I think I hit it because the creature let out a horrible scream, louder than the gunshot itself. It ran off and I didn't care where. I just got in the truck with my dog and sped down the road as fast as I could. Just when I thought I was in the clear, I spotted it again, standing at the side of the road. I floored the gas and didn't stop until I made it into town. Shaken but safe, I decided to head to the nearest big city, far from those woods. Couldn't go back alone. A few days later, I returned with some friends to gather my belongings. As we were packing, I saw it again, standing at the edge of the woods watching us. My friends had brought firearms, and we were ready to defend ourselves if needed. We quickly loaded up the truck and were about to leave when I realized one of my friends was missing. We searched the area and found him outside, barely conscious, with deep claw and bite marks. We rushed him to the hospital, telling the doctors it was a bear attack. Thankfully, he's expected to make a full recovery, but it was a close call. That day, any desire I had to live in that cabin vanished. Now, I'm staying with family, looking for a new place to live. The moral of the story? Never get too comfortable living alone in the forest. You never know what might be lurking out there.